this video we will be going over compression and compressors, which are a huge part of the mixing process and a huge tool to be able to have at your disposal when you're mixing. And basically with compressors, they allow you to control the dynamics of your song and kind of the peaks and the lows of your song. So it's very important in the leveling kind of side of things, leveling being the volume editing process. But basically, if you aren't familiar with this How to Mix series on the Sari channel, basically I take you guys through each of the different tools and give you guys a firm understanding of each tool, each effect in the mixing process, so that you guys can go ahead and make educated decisions on your own, and so that I don't have to preach to you guys and tell you guys little formulas that are inaccurate. Basically, I think by teaching you guys each tool, you guys will be able to make the right decisions in your mix rather than listening to what I think works for me or what works for one situation, if that makes any sense at all. But I think a lot of people are confused about the mixing process because they are hearing all kinds of different formulas from different sources and things that aren't necessarily accurate for their specific situation. And what people don't realize is that mixing is a creative process, and it's not a one trick kind of formula that you can memorize and apply to every situation. Your creative choices are going to be different for each song depending on what you're trying to emphasize in that song. So by teaching you guys the tools individually and giving you guys a simple but firm understanding in a simple way, I think that you guys will be able to make the right decisions on your own. So people usually understand that a compressor compresses the sound or squishes it downwards, and they have like a basic understanding, but they don't understand each of the different parameters, which is what I'm about to go over. All right, so down here, as you can tell, I have a compressor, and this is just the default Ableton compressor. It doesn't matter what type of program you're using or what compression VST you're using. All of these rules are the same for all compression. Compression is the same whether you're using FL Studio or Cubase or a third-party VST. But basically, compression brings the volume of a sound closer together, and it compresses the sound. And the best way to describe this is if I look at this clip right here and play it, you can see there's certain loud peaks and then there's little sounds in between. Now obviously these are at different volumes, and a compressor will allow you to bring the whole thing, all these volumes closer together. First of all, before we get into all the parameters, we want to go over the applications of compression. And really there's two main situations that compressors are used. The first one is that a compressor can be used to bring volumes closer together. So like I showed you guys in this clip right here, there's some loud peaks and then there's some lower peaks. Now a compressor can compress down these loud peaks in order to make this whole clip compressed. Basically all the volumes are going to be closer together and more equal. And then the second way that compression can be used is to emphasize certain peaks and to shape different transients. So a transient or a peak right here is whatever is whenever a certain element of a clip hits, or a certain instrument or a drum or whatever. Basically it's a peak, and you can use compression to emphasize that, and I will go over that in a second. But to go over the first way that we can use it, I'm going to go ahead and turn off makeup gain, and we're going to completely ignore attack and release. So right now we have the threshold and the ratio, and these are the two main parameters in a compressor. How I would describe this is the threshold is kind of like the ceiling that you're setting for the volume. So literally it would be the ceiling of what you want your audio to come out as. So let's say this is, I don't know, 0 decibels. If I wanted to, I could turn this to -6, and now all the volume, now this is going to be our ceiling. So whenever one of these peaks hits, it's going to go over -6, and our compressor is going to kick in and try to limit that. And the ratio is kind of the strictness, like how strict the ceiling is. Like, I don't know how to describe it. It would be kind of like the slope. So if I go into this mode right here, our ceiling, let me go ahead and lower this even more. Our ceiling is this line right here, and the ratio is kind of like the slope. At infinity, it's basically a very hard ceiling. There's no crossing the line, and then everything below infinity to 1 is going to leave some leeway, I guess. And you're probably wondering why you would want to go less than infinity, because obviously you want to limit the volume completely. But the problem is, once you start flattening things out like that, you start getting distortion. So sometimes it's a more intelligent choice to just go a little bit lower with the ratio. But again, the threshold is the ceiling, kind of the height, the volume that you want to start limiting, and then the ratio is how intense the ceiling is. And 1 to 1 means that it's literally letting everything go through. But anyways, let's go ahead and demonstrate this real quick with this clip. And again, I turned off the makeup gain. I'll go over what that is in a little bit, but I can bring down this threshold, and then as I turn up the ratio, you can start to hear that all the volume is being compressed. And let me go ahead and take this and flatten this into a new track. Freeze this track, and now we can look at the new audio clip. Everything is way flatter. As you can tell, it's literally limited right at our volume. Look how flat the peak is. So again, when you start going too harsh with the ratio, the reason why they have lesser ratios is because you start to lose the dynamics of your song or your track when you start limiting things too harshly. So always keep that in mind when you're doing compression. But basically, that's all there is really to it. So really remember, the threshold is your ceiling, and the ratio is how strict this invisible ceiling is going to be. With a little bit less than infinity, you're going to still have a little bit of volume coming through, and then infinity is like kind of the maximum. Everything in between is less than a flat ceiling, I guess. So hopefully that made sense, but we're going to move on to the next way that you can use a compressor. The second way a compressor is commonly used is to emphasize or to shape certain peaks in a song, or certain peaks that are crossing a certain line. Now right now we have the basic compressor. So if I play it right here, you can see this little GR, that means gain reduction. So with this infinity to 1 ratio, so this flat ceiling, every time this kick hits and crosses our threshold of -12, that's about how much volume is being reduced. Now there's no specific number in this particular compressor, but it's visually showing us with the yellow that it's being reduced a significant amount. So with shaping a peak, what they've added in compressors is they've added attack and release. Now this has nothing to do with compression itself, but it is an envelope for the gain reduction that comes from the compression. So attack affects how long it takes for the gain reduction to come in, and then release is how long it takes for it to fade out. So right now both of them are near 0, so they're basically instant. So the gain reduction is following the exact kind of peaks, the exact layout of this clip. So immediately after it hits the threshold, it's being reduced, and then as soon as it stops hitting the threshold, the gain reduction goes away. But when you start bringing up attack, you start to let part of the kick come through, or part of whatever is crossing the threshold come through. So for 5 milliseconds currently, or 6 milliseconds, this kick, which usually is crossing the threshold, is being allowed to come through because the gain reduction isn't being introduced fast enough. And what this will do is that it will emphasize this first little part in the kick. It's going to emphasize and pull out, kind of bring out the punchiness of the whole kick. It's really pushing that through. It's letting it through, literally. Now release is going to affect how fast gain reduction fades away. So if I start to pull this out, you can see the compression becomes very exaggerated. Now when you mix this with attack, you can get kind of a very specific envelope for your compression and really put a lot of emphasis on that transient or on that peak. Transient and peak means the same thing. In conclusion, attack and release are time parameters. They affect how fast it either fades, how fast the gain reduction fades in, or how fast it fades out. And when you turn both of them off, it just becomes similar to a limiter. And then again, the ratio is the strength of the compression, or the strength of the ceiling, how aggressive it is, and then the threshold is the actual height of the ceiling. It's where you want your limit to be. And again, a limiter is just a compressor that's on infinity to 1, and it has no time parameters. It's just an instant way to kind of put a boundary for your song. And basically this whole technique of using attack and release, the transient attack, the gain reduction attack and the release, this is useful in situations where you want to bring out sharpness or punchiness from different elements, because as you can tell, there's elements that are crossing the threshold, so you may want to selectively let those through for a little bit just to bring up the loudness of the attack of the sound, the first part of the sound. So in a mix, you may want the snare to hit through and be louder and sharper in the whole mix and really stand out that way. So attack and release would be useful for that kind of stuff, but it can be for any sound. So even for a stabby kind of synth preset, you could add a compressor and make it even more, have a more sharp texture by bringing in this attack a little bit, letting it through. Now these parameters right here are different ways to, peak and RMS are different volume measurements. So the compressor works the same, but if you're more comfortable with RMS, then you can do that. But really peak is just the typical volume measurement that we use. RMS is some kind of average kind of thing. I don't know the formula behind it, or I can't recall. But expand mode is basically the opposite of what we're doing. It'll actually make the sounds louder that are, I think, is anything that's crossing the threshold will get louder, or I need to think about it. Let me go ahead and play this. Yeah, basically it just does the opposite. Instead of being a limiter, it'll be an expander, so the volume's gonna get louder. It's a kind of reverse compression. You can go ahead and experiment with that. The same kind of rules apply, except the ratio seems to be like flipped in the case of the expander. And makeup gain is a volume setting that, so when you apply compression, you'll notice that the volume gets a lot quieter. Makeup gain will make up that volume so that you're not losing loudness when you compress, and you can keep kind of relatively balanced volume even after compression. And I'll put up the formula for how makeup gain works, but basically you add the threshold to the end of the whole compressed product, and it keeps it loud so that it's not fading away and you can hear what you're doing. And by default it's always going to be enabled, but again you can disable it, and really compression is just comes down to the threshold and the ratio. So hopefully that helped you guys out, and hopefully you learn. And again, this is the How to Mix series where we go over each of the different tools. Instead of giving you out of context formulas or giving you a one case scenario, I try to explain things in a way that you guys will understand the whole fundamental process and make your own educated decisions. So go ahead and leave a like if you learned something, and subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys next time.